Tom Phillips, welcome. Thank you for coming in. Who are you?
Thank you for asking me. I'm a town planner as my main that pays the bills. So I run a planning consultancy, Tom Phillips and Associates, which I set up in 2002 with two colleagues, John and Gavin, and we've run the business since then. I came from a company called Frank Benson and Partners, so I'd been a partner with Frank Benson, who was an excellent planner, and unfortunately died quite young in 2001. And in terms of a primary degree, I did an unusual route to being a planning consultant in that I studied art history and English. And the reason I studied art history and English was because I'd actually set off to be a lawyer on foot of my father's pleading. My father was a brilliant man, and he really thought, because I used to argue quite a bit with him as a teenager, he said to me, Tom, you should really be a barrister. My father was in the grain business, so he wasn't a barrister himself, but he always liked the law. And he just tried to encourage me to be a planner or to be a lawyer. And unfortunately, through not studying hard enough in fifth year, and hopefully my two twin 17-year-olds won't be listening to this, but I didn't manage to get into law. So I did an art history degree and English degree with the view of doing the bar afterwards. But I actually grew to love architecture through doing art history. And I had a brilliant professor, Alistair Owen, who encouraged me then to do town planning. So I did town planning after doing the primary degree. I did 2 years in UCD. And then I went to the UK and worked for an architecture company called Terry Farrell, who'd be well known in the modern architecture. Worked with him for 4 years, came back, and Frank Benson took me on for 2 weeks, and we became business partners and worked with him for 7 years until he died. And then I set up my own practice, and we've grown from 7 people. We've now got 32 people. We've got 16 in Dublin and 16 in Cork.
Wow. And
that's the practice. And we would tend to be seen as being very pro-development. And we're deliberately so, because I'm passionate about development. I love it. And I always say to people, it's a planning and development act. It's not a planning act or a development act. It's a planning and development act. And the whole purpose of the planning act is to facilitate development. Yeah. It was interesting with your talk with Brendan a few weeks ago, Brendan Slattery, where you're talking about the fun fairs. The only thing that the planning act says in the preamble that it's set out to control is fun fairs. Everything else is to be provided for: houses, roads, schools, etc. It's a provision act, but it's being treated as if it's not a provision act. And the comment about the treacle came from a Scottish architect in 2004 that I remember reading the article in the Irish Times, where he left Ireland and he said he was so frustrated being an architect in Ireland, having trained in Scotland, because he said every day was like wading through treacle. I just thought it was a really good analogy, and I've used it ever since.
And that was years ago.
Years, 2004, and now like in 2025, so it's 21 years ago, a generation ago.
Yeah, and what's we don't have video, but you brought a very interesting book in here today to show me, which I think is interesting, because if 20 years ago they thought running through treacle, the last episode we were talking to Brendan Slattery about the length of the Planning Act, and I was making the point that they're kind of proud as about how long it is, which is sort of a weird, perverse thing. But Tom has brought in a book here called A Guide to the Planning Act that was written by Kevin I. Nolan, who is the grandfather of Kevin Nolan of Hibernia.
And father of Bill. And grandfather of Rod and all the other Nolans. Yeah.
And if you could see this book in front of me, it's about 3/4 of an inch thick. And it has both the 1963
and the 1976 Act, and an explanation of both of them.
So they're both published in full and an explanation. And this book it's not an inch thick. It's
A5.
Yeah, it's also an A5, and it's like decent typeface in it too. So that's where we started. We don't have a copy of the new Planning Act here because, despite being a construction company, we don't have machinery capable of lifting it. It's so goddamn big. So if that Scottish architect, I wonder what he would think.
Given up, absolutely.
He wouldn't be too thrilled.
I just did a bit of analysis on it, actually, just the 1963 Act. So the 63 Act came out in 1963, obviously in August, but actually it commenced on the 1st of October 1964. So on the 1st of October 2024, it was 60 years old. And in 1963, it had 92 sections. In the amendment in 2000, it had 277 sections. And in the 2024 version, it has 637. So it went from 92 to 637 sections. And that is the Planning Act. And on foot of the Planning Act, we'll also have to have the new planning regulations, which are bound to be even more than 900 something pages long.
And what's really happened in that time, which I think is interesting, right? So if you leave out the 1960s and 70s, which economically were sort of very bad times here, and not that the 80s were particularly good, but things generally started to improve a little bit after that. We consistently built more and more houses every year up until 2006, which is the peak of some would say the madness, but as it happens now, all those houses are occupied. And then we had the big crash. And then since then, we've struggled to get back to housing output numbers of the early 90s. We've struggled to get back to that when the population was about 50% lower than it is today. So the increase in complexity in the Planning Acts seem to correlate pretty closely with falling output, not just of housing, right, of all forms of infrastructure.
It's more complex.
Yeah, it's more complex, but it also seems to be coming from a place of stopping rather than from enabling, right? Like
Correct.
The complexity is not saying, here's all the things we need to consider to get this done. It's here's all the ways that we can stop things if it's not exactly right. Like there's another thing that you brought in very kindly, and you sent me the digital version of it, which felt smaller because I now have it in hard copy, and it's basically a book you've written. It's a presentation, but it's essentially a book about invalidation.
Yeah.
So something that we probably actually haven't discussed because we never shut up talking about planning on this podcast. But one of the things we probably haven't discussed is validation. Yeah. You might just give us a quick.
Okay, so there are 31 planning authorities in Ireland. There used to be 86 until about 2014 when the government changed. And I actually made the point one time that if China had the same number of planning authorities as Ireland pro rata, then it would have 26,000 planning authorities. So luckily we had 86, and the minister, Phil Hogan, changed it to 31.
And that they were like city planning and then like counties and cities. And
I made a joke one time at a conference because people were complaining about the lack of democracy, about getting rid of some of the planning authorities. And I said, in fairness, I felt very guilty about, because I was promoted that we needed fewer than 86. And I said that Templemore Town Council had its own planning department, and they actually had increased, they'd done 50% more in 2012 than they'd done in 2011. Because in 2011, I think they had processed 4 planning applications, and in 2012, they processed 6. So their workload had doubled. I'd not got about 50%. So it's just kind of a jokey thing. But
I didn't know this.
Yeah.
Templemore.
I
have been there. This is not
where the guards are.
Yeah. I mean, there's not really anything else there apart from the Garda College.
Yeah.
That had its own planning department.
It had its own planning department. Yeah, and it was assessing applications. So now we've got 31. And I did this report not for any client but for myself, and because the other thing I should have mentioned actually as well, I've been lecturing in UCD since 1993. So I came back from the UK in 1993. And was given a job by my former lecturers to write a report. And then they asked me would I become a lecturer. So now I've been lecturing there since 1993 and was made adjunct associate professor of planning a few years ago, which was amusing because it started off doing art history, and my lecturer on the first day had said, "Oh, you'll have difficulty," because no one had done it from art history before. They'd done it from law and from whatever. But I'd learned how to use a scale ruler and how to read drawings and know every single part of a building through doing art history, because we specialised in architectural history.
Oh, okay.
And Alistair Owen, who's still, thank God, is still alive, was a brilliant lecturer, and he taught us how to use scale rulers, how to look at buildings, how to assess them, etc. And that's how I came to planning as a student, understanding what a building did or what it looked like. And in my 2 years in UCD, I never actually used a scale ruler as a planner. So when I teach now, I do 8 days a year, 8 to 10. My second or third lecture is how to read drawings. I teach planning students how to read drawings, how to hold a scale ruler, how to work it out, how to interpret scale.
It's not well known that a lot of people that work in planning can't read drawings.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah,
and it was a problem, and it was an acknowledged problem a few years ago when they brought in a number of temporary board members into the Planning Appeals Board.
Yeah,
that they didn't come from a background where they were trained how to use.
Yeah, and it's not their fault, right? I'm not having to go with them. Like, it's not an easy thing to read a 2D drawing. Like, it's something that you have to be shown how to do.
Absolutely, and it's hugely important that planners can do that. So,
the validations or invalidation.
So invalidation came around. I think sometimes I felt because of an inability of either us acting on behalf of developer to put forward clear drawings to a local authority, or a local authority's ability to read the drawings.
Yeah.
or something in between. And we had 31 planning authorities. I remember one time down the country talking to a local authority planner, and she said, "Oh, well, that might be what you do up in Dublin, but it's not what we want here." And I was saying, "But you've got 31 planning authorities. We've only got one planning act and one planning regulations, or one set of planning regulations. We don't have 31 interpretations of what should be in a set of application drawings." Yeah. So I looked at this, and what was shocking was that the average number of applications that are invalidated, and I'll explain that in a minute what that means, is 15.5%. And what it meant was that in the past, you would be delighted if your client got a permission. And then in the 2000 Act, they brought out these much more stringent rules about what should be in a planning application. And it came about within the first year or two that the local authorities were told that if a drawing and if the documentation that you get is not compliant with the tick box of the regulations, that it shall be invalidated. So in other words, you start again. So like snakes and ladders, you go back down to 0 and you have to start again. You have to do 10 of this or 6 of that, like a kind of a big version of Noah's Ark. You have to have 6 of those, 3 of those, 1 of those, the full page of the newspaper, not just part of the newspaper, the full actual page with a red box around the site notice and all these different things. And I was looking at that some local authorities, to me, were off the Richter scale in terms of invalidation. So one local authority in particular, in the period I looked between 2009 and 2020, had invalidated more than 30% of all planning applications. And they received 186 per year, which is less than 1 per working day. And they invalidated more than 30%. So I would say, why didn't they just put somebody at the front desk and their job is this week is to validate all the applications before they're coming into the system, and just go through them and have a tick box and tick them. And then if you got all the tick boxes of all the 31 authorities, they'd be different. So years ago, I was down in Limerick, I was looking on the walls of the planning authority, and I was thinking to myself, that wouldn't get through in Dublin, because Dublin would want something slightly different than they want in Limerick. But it's the same regulations. So I wrote this report in the kind of vain hope that the government might do something. And what I said was that, and this wasn't just kind of a big complaint, but I said if you had a paid and not an opt-in, that you had to pay either €10 if it was one-off house, or €100 for a scheme of this size, or €1,000 if it's a scheme of that size, you pay to the local authority and they validate your scheme over 24 hours, and then it's validated. So it's actually validated from the outset. There's no such thing as invalidation. Yeah. And I actually also said that on Board Penola, who's had a lot of criticism, but on Board Penola have a very good system of validation, and they have a very low rate of invalidating appeals because they go through it all. And in the SHDs, there was a very low rate of invalidations there were way more complex applications, but they weren't invalidated. So invalidation means that you could be 8 weeks in waiting for your decision, and suddenly you get a letter from the local authority saying this wasn't a valid application because you missed out. You only had 5 drawings of the 3rd floor of the building, and you should have had 6. Yeah. So just to put it, and I worked out how much money the government would have made in that period had they brought it in. And it's in the millions. And they could have funded the whole planning system by just bringing in this simple idea.
And that's a simple thing, like for the government in terms of revenue, but there's other costs associated with this, like the delay that things like that. I had no idea, first of all, it was as high as 15%. The delays that are introduced into the entire development cycle by stuff like that are vast, right? Mm-hmm. Because people think, oh, it's 8 weeks, you just stick the application back in. Like, that's not how that works, right? Like, you get that invalidation, you go back to your planning consultant, your architect, all the consultants, everyone has to go and get everything, perhaps even print additional things, make sure, pay the application fee again, send it all back over again, wait a further 8 weeks, and you could be invalidated a second time if people wanted to go down that road. Instead of having a scenario where they look at it and they go, oh yeah, they're missing this, and they just ring up the planning consultant and go, Tom, you idiot, you never sent in the newspaper notice, will you send it over to me there?
Correct, yeah.
But that's not what happens.
No, and then there's a funny thing that in the guidelines that are brought out, they said that they talk about the concept of de-invalidation. So in other words, it said in the rare examples where a local authority might invalidate something in error, there's no mechanism to revalidate it. Yeah. And they give an example. We did one years ago where we got, on the day we were expecting a decision on a quarry application, it came out that the thing had been invalidated. And I rang up the planner, who I knew really well. I said, what bloody hell is this about? And he said, oh, it seems that your client has already started extracting the gravel. And we said, he hasn't. He hasn't. And then he said, oh, no, they have. And then we said, that's the field adjoining it that already has permission. The application's for the next field, not the one that your colleague has gone on and checked. And he said, oh, sorry. So we had to start again.
Yeah.
Now, the government guideline says that in those rare, inverted commas, instances where the local authority make a mess and do it, that there should be suitable redress. And they give the example that they should pay for a new site notice. So I've made the point, and I've actually, the other thing I didn't mention at the start, I also do a bit of development from time to time, and have done 2 buildings. And so I've been, and including one during the recession. So I know what it's like to have a bank breathing down the back of your neck looking for the money. And I was thinking to myself, I remember how much money we were paying per month on interest on a vacant site. And if I'd lost 2 months, I worked out it would have cost us €20,000. I would have lost just on and mine wasn't a mega scheme. Yeah. So if you're doing a scheme that's in the millions and you're set back 2 months because of some error in a local authority, are you going to say, well, hang on, I'm going to get €456 to put an ad in the Star next Tuesday, so everything's
this is all fine,
fine, we're all grand, we'll just move on. These things happen. Yeah. So it's just wrong. So the system is inherently, and I kind of sound like I'm playing to the gallery, but it's against developers. It's for the public, because they're always worried about the public. But the public don't live in houses unless the developers build them. Yeah. And you can't have a system that you've got invalidation. You just can't. Yeah. And why doesn't the local authority? If a local authority were to pay €20,000 in a fine, they wouldn't invalidate things incorrectly.
Yeah, that's true. So, but then, I mean, the whole idea of local authorities and board planning, because I know that's a feature of the new act, that there would be like fines for not meeting statutory timelines.
Yeah, I'll tell you the funny one about that.
It's like public entities are being fined by the government who fund them. So
yeah, I know, and I have to be very careful in this talk, because I don't you don't criticise City Hall, and particularly being a planning consultant, I have a lot of time for Board Panola, and I defended them on a lot of radio shows and things over the years. But one thing that did annoy me was that then chairperson in the Oireachtas committee back, I think in 2023, she was talking about the fact of so many strategic housing development schemes that had been delayed, and so a developer pays €80,000 to make an application, and then they're delayed in the Planning Appeals Board. And the board were obliged to give back €10,000 to developers. Mm. But a developer X pays €80,000 and he or she gets back €10,000. And the board at the time, board chairperson at the time, referred to it as a windfall gain for developers. So you pay $80,000 for a service, you don't get it, you get $10,000 back, and that's called a windfall. It's not. It's state money. It's your own money. You're getting back 1/8 of the money that you paid to the system.
I just will add that to the list of absolutely crazy things that have been said in Oireachtas committees.
I don't want to criticise them, but that to me is wrong.
No, look, in fairness,
what way you put it,
they do their best, but like it's just stuff like that annoys me. Not because that it matters, right? Because it doesn't matter, but it's again this idea of them and us. Like, as you point out, if people are going to build houses, who's going to build them, right? We're going to build them, mm-hmm. right? So who's going to do the planning, right? We can't do that. That has to be the planning authorities. Yeah. So that should be symbiosis, right? Like we should be working hand in glove to make sure that things are done. But that is not how the system is set up. It's set up adversarially.
It's funny because I've just noticed in my 30 or whatever odd years of lecturing to students, and something I want to get to maybe resources. But I was looking around this year, 42 students have just finished yesterday on a Sunday correcting the last of 42 essays for the students. And it's a really multicultural class. There's a complete mix of students. Yeah. And there are students from Ireland. There's students from there's one Italian, there's a German girl. There are 2 guys from Pakistan, about 6 Indians, about 6 Chinese, 3 Americans and a Canadian, and the rest are Irish out of 42. So it's really multicultural. And one of the reasons I lecture in UCD, and I've been very open about this, is that I use it to find really good staff members. So my 2 co-directors that set up the company with me, John Gannon and Gavin's the current president of the Planning Institute. Both of those were former students of mine. I just asked them to come work with us. But I couldn't employ a big chunk of the class. I can't employ if I could, even if they wanted to come work for me, because they can't get visas to work in Ireland. Yeah. So we're actually employing or educating people at a master's degree level that we can't employ.
Turfing them out.
Because the critical skills list omits planners. Yeah. And I was thinking about this, whether I should say this or not, because I have a friend of mine, Ruth, who's a very good podiatrist in Rathmines. And a podiatrist is on the list of critical skills. Oh. But planners aren't. And there are excellent planners. Like the planner who scored the highest in the master's degree program in 2023 is an Indian girl, and she's really excellent. And they're really good. I mean, I was reading the essays, just really excellent essays.
Yeah.
But I can't employ them because we can't get them jobs in the country. And we raised this through Gavin, through the Planning Institute, has raised this loads of times. And the Department of DETI, as they're called, came back recently and said, well, we didn't know there was a need for more planners. No one told. It was in the paper recently, and we got something back from the journalist, sent it to us and said, what do you think of this? And they said they didn't know it. So on the critical skills list are podiatrists. Now, last time I checked, there wasn't a foot crisis in Ireland, but we have a housing crisis. And I made the comment at a conference. Sometimes I might take things come into my head, and I made the comment that the state was like a basking shark going around taking in all the planners like plankton. Yeah. And I said we were losing staff members to. I actually remember a lady in the board panel a few years ago said, "God, Tom, you've got great staff. Anybody who's come to the board from your office is great." And I said, "Well, Mary, I'd like to hang on to them, please. Don't take my staff." But the LDA. And the LDA are really good clients of ours. And I was ringing John afterwards. John Coleman said, I didn't mean it wasn't a criticism of the LDA, nor is it a criticism of the OPR or anybody else. But the state has thrown money at the resources of planners, but we don't have enough planners generated. So there's 42 planners this year in the master's program, but 2 years ago there were 5. So during the recession, there were no planners going through the system, or very few. Yeah. So it's a missing cohort of planners. And if we could open our doors to Indians, Pakistanis, Canadians, New Zealanders, all those people, Americans, and they could come in. So we have a really excellent planner down in our Cork office, Gemma, who came from Canada, and we took 6 months to get her into the country. And it was like, she knows, we said that some days we're thinking, oh God, I hope she better be good, because this is a lot of effort. Whereas like, you can be a podiatrist and come into Ireland on a critical skills list, but you can't be a planner. Whereas the list has got town planners, architectural technicians, all of those. So it gives a heading and town planning's in it, but the actual list excludes town planners. And the ministerial action plan back in October said that planners will be on the critical skills list. And in January or in December, the department said, well, no one told us. So they're not on the critical skills list. So there's only a certain number of resources.
What's annoying about stuff like that is that's a stroke of a pen fix, right? Like
correct.
That's
2 words.
2 words, and it can happen in 10 minutes, and there's no need for any public consultation or Dáil votes or nothing. The minister can just do that and won't.
Well, the minister said, well, first the minister's action plan has said we will do it.
Yeah, but like,
and then other department says, well, no one told us. We didn't know.
This is the thing that really gets my goat about government at the moment, and I think this is a relatively new thing. This kind of finger pointing around the room. Oh yeah, but we didn't say. But the minister, one person, can pick up the phone, ring the senior person in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and say, add that to the critical skills list, do it today. Yeah. And he has that power.
Yeah, agreed.
And doesn't use it. So, we get onto this a lot, and I'm increasingly beginning to lose my patience a bit, because I'm hearing again and again and again all these things about solving the housing crisis and how it's imperative.
One thing that I think was the right thing to do, and I'm involved with Property Industry Ireland, and we're one of the founding directors. We were at the time of it back in 2011, and we were always coming up with different ways of looking at the system. So Mark Fitzgerald was a founder member, and Michael O'Flynn, the Cork developer, etc., etc. And Michael and I were talking one day in 2016 about the system and how it could be improved. And we were saying that there's an inevitability that it was just something I'd done analysis that I used for the students. I was saying that 7% of all planning applications go to Bord Pleanála or appeal. 7%, so 93% don't.
Okay, but so that's all planning applications. So that's even like a shed or
So, but the department had worked out between 2006 and 2016 that 95% of all schemes of 100 or more houses or apartments or whatever went to the Planning Appeals Board. Right. So it went from being 7% to 95%. So it was inevitable that they go to the Planning Appeals Board. So we come up and said, how could we come up with a system that if it's inevitable it goes to the Planning Appeals Board, what could happen? And in fairness to Simon Coveney, had been appointed as Minister for Housing, and he was criticised because he went on his holidays and he had said, I will have an action plan for housing the first 100 days of being in office. And I remember the paper, the examiner said, minister goes on holidays while he's doing his action plan. But he delivered the action plan in 100 days. And part of that was the introduction of this strategic housing development, which was that you apply directly to the Planning Appeals Board as opposed to the local authority. Now, that is something that if the most frustrating thing I found in my career to date has been the reaction to that system.
Yeah.
And it is because, well, first of all, that there was an article written a few years ago that as if the minister was hoodwinked into it. It wasn't. The minister wrote to everybody and put it publicly out that he wanted people to make submissions on ways in which the planning system could be improved. And we put forward through Property Industry Ireland the idea that you just apply directly. So I've been involved with Gavin, my co-director, back in the start of the business with the Corrib gas field. And everything we did went to the Planning Appeals Board. If they wanted to put in a bicycle shed at the back, someone would object to it.
And that's because it was strategic infrastructure, right? It was on that list.
It triggered it. I remember listening to Brandon's thing and said about other things. So it was one of the key triggers in 2006 where they introduced strategic housing or infrastructure development where you apply directly to the Planning Appeals Board.
Okay.
So SHD, which is strategic housing development, is a form of SID.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's just for housing as opposed to hospitals or runways. And what really frustrates me about the discourse on it, for want of a better phrase, is this inference that it somehow was anti-democratic or a bypass to local authority. It didn't, because a local authority is obliged to engage. You couldn't go directly to the Planning Appeals Board. Yeah. You as developer must go at least once to the local authority and sit down and go through the scheme and get an opinion from the local authority and feedback. And then at a certain trigger date, you could then go to the board. So you had to go to the local authority. The other thing that's unique about it is it's the only form of development in which local councillors were invited to make comments. So they're not otherwise. There's no right of a commentary by a councillor on any form of development other than strategic housing development. And they did. And the criticism of some of these government initiatives is, they're just paper. But in fairness, the Action Plan for Housing 2016 said, we will introduce fast-track planning, as it was called. It was supposed deemed to be fast-track, but it actually didn't turn out to be fast-track. But we will introduce it, and he did it. So he did what he said he would do. And there's a lot of good initiatives in these action plans. They just take so long. And you can see with the Planning Act, it's just such a complex document. I mean, the amount of senior counsel and Declan Brazel, the planning consultant, was involved. There's a lot of people, and there's just so much legislation thrown at us and case law, and they're trying to plug every gap. It's like a big dike being trying to fill all the holes.
Well, I mean, if you're asking everyone's opinion, you're obviously, that's what you're going to end up with.
Well, absolutely.
When people say that these things are anti-democratic, they really don't understand what democracy is, because democracy is the triumph of the many over the few, right?
The common good.
Common good. And what happens actually in the planning system is the triumph of the few over the many, because the common good is build houses, and the way to prevent that is an individual, just be one person, can hold up housing for 1,000 people for years.
For €20.
Yeah, so I actually had this debate with Simon Coveney a number of years ago. It's something about the Apple data center. So I asked him a question at a conference. I asked, did he think it was undemocratic that one person, who it turned out was actually a competitor, wanted Apple to buy his land for a data center, could hold up something as monumental as that, particularly given where it was going to be. And I think he kind of knew the answer, but couldn't give it publicly. Yeah. But that was in 2015.
About that, Jen, you always have this. It's like one of these things like years ago. Why can't I do something? Oh, foot and mouth. Why can't I do something? Oh, COVID. Why can't I do something in planning? Oh, the Aarhus Convention.
Yeah.
And it gets dragged into everything as if, better not ask anything. Yeah, we have the most democratic planning system in the world. So for €20, and some of the students are bemused because what's some more mature, as in like just older American students, and they're kind of bemused by the fact that in Ireland, that you don't have to live in Ireland to object to an Irish scheme. Nope. They could live in Wyoming or Kansas or whatever and object to something in Ireland and send over €20 on their credit card and hold up a scheme, or have the right to hold up a scheme.
Yeah, and America obviously has we won't get into it, but it has its drawbacks. One of the things I thought was interesting this week, just with what's gone on in California with the fires, that the governor of California said he's going to waive all of planning laws in California to allow people to rebuild their houses with zero red tape. So they're not going to have to
Yeah.
They just have to build the house the same way it was.
Yeah, yeah.
And so there's going to be no process.
Yeah, we're in Ireland, if your building burns down, your planning permission burns with it. You start again.
Where are we with planning permissions right now? Do you have any?
Well, we should be building 60,000 units per annum. We're not. We're building around 30,000 odd.
Okay, so we're about halfway down on where we need to be.
I did a thing a few months ago for the Irish House Builders Association and looking at all the different range of figures. So there was no agreement among state reports as to how many units were built or should be built. So the house,
but just to stop you there for a second, there's no agreement on how many units were built.
No, should be built.
Okay.
Well, obviously, for were built was kind of a dispute over the ESB figures used to be used, and then people said, well, if you put a shed out the back of your house and put a plug into it, that would be deemed to be a unit, and they've got over that. And
okay. So now we know how many units are being built.
Yeah.
Right. Do we know how many are getting planning?
We do, yeah, because that's in the. So about 64% of all permissions are residential across everything. So the planning housing is the biggest part of all the permissions. And there's the data come out every year and it'll tell you how many planning permissions and how many are granted, how many are refused. And there's quite a big disparity between certain local authorities as to whether they're the most likely to grant or refuse. So there's actually is no consistency across the 31 local authorities.
Yeah.
Some have a very high rate of refusal, some have a very low rate of refusal.
Yeah.
And some have, I did that part of the analysis. We looked at those which had a high rate of invalidation and did they also have a high rate of refusal? And there was no real correlation. Some had high invalidation, low refusal. Others had low invalidation, high refusals. Others had a mixture of all things.
So it's all over the map.
Yeah.
Okay.
But actually interesting about the SHD, the strategic housing development thing, is that it was like as if, sometimes the debate is like as if something's a contagion. For example, the two things that are banned under Irish planning law are one that involves under Section 37 involves nuclear fusion or fission. So the state is precluded from granting permission that involves nuclear fission. So we can't build nuclear power stations. And the other, and I've heard you talk about it in your build programs before, is the dreaded co-living and build to rent. The two dreadful things that we could. So nuclear power stations
and co-living
and build to rent.
And according to some industry commentators, well, I wouldn't call them industry commentators, some people in the media, co-living is worse than a nuclear power station.
Oh, it is, yeah. The one just finished actually in Donnybrook. I'm trying to see what it's like when it's open, but I've been to one out in Dunleary and I've seen some of the UK, and I mean, to me, that would really anger me.
But again, it's like that's just more of the them and us thing, right? Like the co-living people, like, oh, it's disgraceful you're building bedsits. Like these are not bedsits, right?
We had 5 in our office. We had 5 schemes in gestation in our office the day that we heard that they were all shut down.
Yeah.
5 projects went down the drain. Yeah. And co-living, anybody wants to know what it's like slightly older version of student housing. It's people like who would be in their 20s or 30s, or people moving over to Ireland.
But it's a better version of what goes on anyway. Like everybody that I know in college went and rented a house in Rathmines, and there was 6 or 8 or sometimes 12 people, even though there might only have been 6 rooms. And it was great crack. And everyone was getting pissed and maybe going to college on the side. And it was a great time, right?
Yeah.
But they were old houses. They were unsuitable.
Yeah.
They were energy inefficient. They were terrible. Mm-hmm. And co-living is formalizing that and saying, okay, you're getting a clean bedroom and your own bathroom. You're going to share a kitchen with your roommates, and you can still get pissed and have the crack.
Yeah. And
what's wrong with that?
Well, you can't. The last thing you do in a housing crisis is to preclude certain forms of tenure. You have to keep all types available. Yeah. And the thing with years ago, they were banned bed sits, and then they came back in by the back door about 2 years later. It was kind of snuck back in again. You could have bed sits again. Yeah,
because they realised.
Well, where do all the people in Rathmines who work in whatever, who lived in the 10% of Rathmines were bed sits? Yeah. Where do they all live? Those are people all displaced.
Yeah, how are you going to provide very, very low cost for them? Because it's all well and good, like all the high-minded stuff that goes on about, we need to lower housing costs. And I heard some absolutely batshit proposals about having a state building company, like the state ever lowers the cost of anything when it gets involved.
Actually, I often thought it great. Imagine on 4:30 on a Friday when you've got kind of wet concrete and you need to have it floated or whatever. And you say to a guy, well, I need to stay on and finish off that job because it's 4:30.
I just
Friday. I'm not going to be
when
here.
I hear people talk about that and have to have a swing at some of the people in the media here that give oxygen to this stuff. Why are they never asked? Give us one example of when the state ever built anything cost effectively. Like
I'll tell you
once in history.
I'll tell you a brilliant place, and you should go down and see it. Everybody in Ireland should go and look at it. And I have to mention my classmates from planning. We have a great I'm still friendly. We left in 1989 and we still are on a WhatsApp and we talk all the time. And two of my classmates are former board members.
Okay.
I couldn't talk to them whether we're board members. One might be the planning regulator, very good friend of mine, and the others some had been board inspectors and others local authorities, and we're all friends, but we all I would fundamentally disagree with most of them about planning. We're still all great friends, but we go on a trip every year around September. We went to Ardna, Crusha.
Oh yeah,
and it's absolutely fascinating, that place. It's a
hydroelectric power plant,
and we were all debating how difficult it would be to get planning permission to build that today.
Yeah,
you wouldn't
get it.
You'd never get it.
No, and it's there 100 years.
I think it was 1929, and they built something like a 9 kilometer long canal. They built to create it, and you just couldn't get it through now.
Yeah,
but it's fantastic, and it was done by it's a brilliant story.
Siemens built it, didn't they?
Yeah. My father-in-law is German. He always says it's not Siemens, it's Siemens. But he also told me about that. What amazed me about that? Sorry, I digress. But they have a warehouse down there that actually has parts that Siemens provided when they built it that have never been used because it was so good. And the Irish state, did a fantastic job of that.
Yeah.
But that would
never. So
never.
there's one that was 100 years ago.
Superb, but we could do it then. And it's everybody who's involved in the property business or interested in it should go and look at it. It's an incredible place.
Yeah, I've been.
And there's a great quote actually from Sean Lemass was open to, and he's talking about women should be. It was just funny. He was saying that a woman, when she's getting married, shouldn't be asking her husband how much road frontage he has, but what's his ability to get a fridge and a freezer and all these electrical, because it was so unique. It was just, and it's like something from the dark ages, but it's just,
there's
it's
some
funny.
Advice for you now, Corey.
No, but it was funny, you know.
You're on Tinder, you can just ask the guy what his access to appliances.
My daughters wouldn't find that funny, but I just thought it was amusing because it just shows you how far we moved on in one way, in terms of that and social norms and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, but how far we haven't moved on in terms of infrastructure.
Yeah, but we've gotten a bit like the Romans. We've decided that we've won, and that now we get to have all of these ideals of perfection, and we're failing very, very badly at providing basic infrastructure to our citizens.
Well, yeah, it was the thing that just struck me as well. Doing a bit of research a few years ago about this, but Australia, they have a document, Infrastructure Australia, and it's come out in February every year, and it lists off the top 100 pieces of infrastructure that are required in Australia in order of preference. So number one is the most important. Number two is the second. Number three is this. Whereas in Ireland, you could say, well, it could be the road between Limerick and Cork, or perhaps it's the airport runway, or it's the children's hospital, or whatever it is. But we can't agree.
No, we can't. We can't agree on what the most important thing is. We can't agree on how to do it. We can't agree when to do it. We can't agree what it should cost. Like the children's hospital is a great example. That was something that was desperately needed. It was massively under budgeted for, and now it's costing what it's costing. But the prevailing wisdom is it's over budget. It's not over budget. It's just that the budget that was created for it was nonsense, right? For a building of that size
or
and
things
scale.
have moved on. I mean,
things moved on, right?
The known knowns and the unknown unknowns in the Ukrainian war. Look, who's to know that was going to happen? And
and the cost of things, for us, like concrete cost of putting concrete structures doubled in 5 years. So like all of these things, we carry on as though with this expectation of perfection, we're not. No one is able to meet those standards. And so then we fall down, and then the finger pointing starts and the blame game starts. And,
well, actually, that's something about the standards. I was talking to the students just because I find it fascinating, because I've got my own children are of similar age. Two of my older daughters are similar age to the students I'd be teaching at UCD. And I'm asking them, because they're multicultural and different backgrounds, how many of them of the 42 in the class lived in the student accommodation in UCD? And none of them did. Said it was too expensive.
All right.
Because it's really high quality student accommodation, and I think some of the standards. I mean, the problem is it's this. We could talk for an hour and a half, and this could be synopsized. Oh, he's looking for dumbing down of standards. No, I'm not. I'm just saying that sometimes the perfect is the enemy of the good, as Voltaire said. That sometimes you're trying to get the standards are so high that they might as well live in hotels as live in student accommodation.
Michael Flynn has said this numerous times when he's like, if we did this with cars. You would say that only Mercedes or BMWs are allowed, right? No one can have a Dacia.
Yeah.
Because some people can only afford a Dacia, still gets them around.
Correct.
And like the idea that we say, oh, well, no, we want dumbing down standards because the developers want profit. you could very quickly get around that by saying you're allowed to build houses to a slightly lower standard, but price cap them. If it's an A-rated house, it's uncapped. If it's a B-rated house, it has to be capped at this price and that's indexed, right? So you can say, all right, the cost saving that you're going to gain is going to go in the form of cheaper housing. That could easily be accomplished. They do it with the Help to Buy grant. They cap the price that the Help to Buy grant is for. And, a lot of these things, when it comes to the energy efficiency measures, they're things that can be upgraded later. Like, so if people can get their start and get on the housing ladder, say, okay, maybe they can't afford an A-rated house in the area that they want to live in, but they can afford a B-rated one. And then, 5-8 years from now, they say, oh, we've made extra money. We can do more insulation. We can put a heat pump in. We can replace the windows. But there's this idea that no. The only thing we can build is the absolute best version of it. And if you can't afford that, then the state will pay for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But of course, the state can't pay for it because there's so much of it needed. So that's the great lie that's being told all the time, that the state steps in everywhere and pays for everything. The state has limited funds. As much and all as people don't want you to believe that's true, it is true. So then we end up not doing it. Yeah. And then you have a whole generation of people who can't afford to buy a house. They go to Australia, they go wherever, or worse, they stay and endure a terrible quality of life.
Yeah, we had an excellent planner with us a few years ago, Aisling, and she went off to London because the landlord wanted their house back, and Aisling and all her colleagues in the house, rather than to waste time trying to find somewhere in Dublin, just moved to London.
Yeah.
And another friend of mine, his son and 7 of his friends all went to Melbourne because they just couldn't get accommodation in this country.
Yeah,
and we should be building houses. And the other thing I would do, well, I don't want to be jumping one of your questions, but I would ban politicians from objecting to housing.
Yeah, well, that should have happened a long time ago.
You've got councillors who zone land. They're the ones who got the power to zone the land.
Yeah.
And then they go on behalf of a constituent, then object to it. And I had one years ago where a politician, she had written in favour of the scheme and opposed the same scheme. She'd written in twice on two different people, one supporting it and one criticising it. It was the same scheme. I didn't like to embarrass her, but it was just nuts.
Okay, this is going to turn into a rant, right? Okay. So I'm going to throw some acronyms at you because there is a lot of people that listen to this that aren't actually in our industry, and I don't know, they must not have very active social lives to be listening to me droning on, but they do. So they do it to learn. So we're going to try and teach them. STZ, what is that? Okay,
Strategic Development Zone. Actually, one of my lectures in UCD, I have one called Planning is a Load of TLAs, which is planning is a load of 3-letter acronyms. Yeah. And the only one which isn't the 3 letters, obviously LRD, because that's a large scale read, and even though it is 3 letters, but it's actually 4 words. So STZ is a Strategic Development Zone. There are 11 of them in the country. The first one was Adamstown. The last one was Knock Airport.
Oh.
And was designated when I think the Taoiseach of the time may have been from Mayo, if I remember rightly. But so there was, and there are obviously the ones Poolbeg. We're involved in doing that in Dublin. We're involved down in Docklands.
Are they still? They're not being created anymore?
No, sorry. When the new act commences, they can't be created anymore.
Okay.
So they can be created now, and we made a submission on behalf of a major university might be in Limerick a few months ago to have the 12th one created.
Okay. So an STZ is
okay, so I'll bring it back. I'll bring it back to this. So in 2000, they introduced this concept of strategic development zone under the 2000 Planning Act, and it was designed for the IDA because the IDA were frustrated that they had all this foreign direct investment coming in, and they just said, we can't get permission in Ireland. It takes too long. So they brought in this system that in an STZ, it's plan-led development. So a planning scheme is prepared. Now, first of all, the government, it's the only example where the government, rather than the local councillors, designate land. So the Taoiseach of the day, responding to his or her minister for the environment, designates land that is deemed to be of strategic, national or social importance to the state. And it works out to being 1,659 hectares of Ireland. So it's a very small part. It's 0.02% of the state is an STZ, and the other 99.98 isn't an STZ.
Okay.
So that's deemed by councillors. So these are really the kind of primus among whatever, the first among equal, of these are the key bits of land that in the country are designated by the state to deliver of development of economic or social importance. And after, in the machinations of the 2000 Act, they actually at the last minute added in residential. And the bizarre thing is that most of the schemes to date have been residential. And I did a report back in 2021 when I was being frustrated by the criticism that strategic housing development was getting, in that I tried to make a comparison of SHD and SDZ. So strategic housing development versus strategic development zones, because one was deemed to be developer-led planning and the SHDs were deemed to be plan-led development, which I've always found is a very annoying argument, because it isn't so simple that if a developer puts it forward, it's bad. If the state puts it forward, it's good. It's not that simple an argument. Yeah. So the SDZs, back in 2006, or 2021 or 2, we worked out of the 11 SDZs, 6 of them hadn't actually commenced. So there's one Clonmagadden outside Meath, nothing had happened. Others, Monarch, Clonmagadden, I know, well-known. It's outside Navan. And
there's an STZ.
An STZ. You know, the Minister for the Environment may have been from Meath at the time. There's actually a very strong correlation between who the minister's from. But they were designated anyway. That's just a coincidence.
And these things are written down in legislation rather than...
they're designated by the government. Yeah. And then so of the 11... 10, a development agency has to bring forward a scheme called a planning scheme that is then set in stone. That is basically the scheme.
So they do the whole design.
Yeah, that's a development agency. But the development agency in 10 of the 11 cases is the local authority. So in Grange Gorman is the only example where it had its own bespoke development agency independent of the local authority. Okay. And that was to do the university and the healthcare. So those are areas, and then the other ones would be Cherrywood. So you've had on your podcast before Brian Moore, and so Brian would be one of the major developer out in Cherrywood. You've got Johnny Ronan in we're doing the scheme for Johnny in Poolbeg with Linecore. You've got the one in the Grand Canal docks in Dublin and the North Lots. Johnny and others on the Central Bank and the Convention Centre, all those are in it. That area is being done out. Then there's Hansfield, there's Monard in Cork, there is the North Quays in Waterford, there is, so mainly around the Dublin area and Meath. Right. And the major cities, and then obviously over in Knock as well. Okay,
so that's SDZs, right? Strategic Development Zones,
and those have planning schemes, and planning schemes live beyond the life of a development plan. And as long as you build within accordance with your planning scheme, there's no appeal mechanism. So once on Board Penala, and usually is on Board Penala, in the case of I think Waterford and Knock, it was a local authority. There was no appeals. So people can write in and appeal about the planning scheme, but once the board approves it, that's it. Yeah. And the developer gets permission, and there's no appeal mechanism. So
and there's no provision for judicial review?
There is, but there hasn't been. There was in the bizarre one. The judicial review in Docklands was a bizarre one because the Minister, Owen Murphy, in December 2018 told all the local authorities to go away and revise their planning schemes to have greater height. And Dublin City Council did a review. The board took about 3 years actually to determine it, and they came back and refused. So Board Penala refused Dublin City Council's amendments because said they were too low, they hadn't gone far enough. Yeah. And Dublin City Council judicially reviewed the board. So
that's right.
The state. So I think the minister was not hugely impressed by having one entity of the state judicially reviewing another entity of the state.
Kramer stuff.
Yeah, it was a bit. Yeah, so that's been so. But there have been very few, and they tend to be successful in the sense that they give some certainty to developers. But the problem is the IDA has never used it. So the IDA has never been a proponent or never, like it was built for them, but they've never used it.
They never used it, okay.
And because it's sometimes a little bit tricky because you're crystal ball gazing what some FDI might want in 3 years' time, and it shall be this meters by that meter.
Yeah,
that
and you can't change it,
right? You can change it with extreme difficulty. It's really difficult to change it.
Okay. All right, so that's STZs. SHDs we've talked about, strategic housing developments.
Yeah. Which is a form of SID, which is Strategic Infrastructure Development.
Right.
It just means that you apply ultimately to the Planning Appeals Board and not to the local authority.
Because it's going there anyway.
But you go via the local authority. You talk to the local authority and you get all their opinions on it. Okay.
So we won't delve any further into that then. Okay. L or D, large-scale residential development
is the replacement of SHD.
Okay. Why is it different?
It's okay because...
Apart from it's 3 letters. And it should be 4 letters.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm a bit of a pedant about that. But it's different because, well, I have said it's the same as the conventional system to me. It's not much different than a conventional planning application because in an SHD, you go negotiate with, or they're no longer allowed, although there are 27 of them still sitting in a Bord Pleanála waiting to be determined, which is another story.
Actually, 28.
Oh, it's 28, is there?
It was 27, but we had one that was judicially reviewed. And was quashed. And last week or 2 weeks ago, we got a letter, and this is from 3 years ago, we got a letter from Bord Pleanála saying that the High Court has remitted the permission back to them and they're deciding it again now.
Okay, yeah.
So 3 years later, they're starting. So we have another SHD that we thought was dead. That is, I mean, I'm sure
Lazarus has come back to it.
Well, Lazarus continued to live for a little while. I'm not so confident about this, but anyway, sorry for interrupting.
No, so we're just talking there about the
LRD.
The LRD.
They're conventional planning permissions, really.
So the SHD was brought out in 2006, mooted in 2016, came out in 2017, and it had a defined life. So you often see media reports talk about the abandoned SHD and the dreadful system, and it was dumped and abandoned. It was in the program for government to get rid of it, but it was actually always in the legislation that it had a defined life.
Oh right, I didn't know that.
It was never designed to be there forever. It was there for a short period of time, and actually was extended once by the government, as was allowed under legislation. So it was brought out for a defined period, and then they deemed it to be a success. Because my point I'd made is that SHD, which is the dreaded developer-led planning, had delivered way more residential units than the SDZs. So the SDZs had worked out in the 20 years between 2001 and 2021 had actually granted 6,000 residential units, even though it was held up as this fantastic system. Yeah. But in terms of houses, whereas the SHD in 3 years had delivered a multiple of it.
It's as though that there was incentives somehow.
Yeah, so the LRD was brought in as a means of, so it is 100 or more residential units or 200 or more bed spaces in student accommodation, which is the same as the SHD, but you can have up to 30% extra floor space, which is commercial, whereas an SHD was 15%.
Right.
So the SHD scheme, which
you couldn't do mixed use development.
It was tricky, because we were doing one or two, and we were literally kind of Jesuitical arguments about how can we make it, it's 14.9% or it's 14.9 for 5%, and you couldn't risk having an extra square meter because then the thing wouldn't be SHD. And
right.
So an LRD...
It was very inflexible, actually.
It was very inflexible from that point of view. Yeah. So the LRD, thankfully, has got a 30%, so you can have up to 30% of other uses. So it should be commercial or retail, whatever it is. And you've got the housing is 100 units or 200 bed spaces.
Right.
And you apply in the past, in the SHD, in the normal system, you apply to your local authority, one of the 31. And in SHD, you apply to the board, having spoken to the local authority. But in LRD, you apply now to the
council
again.
Yeah.
And then you're open to appeal.
And there's a statutory process that you go through for timelines, right? There's a stage 1, stage 2, stage 3.
Yeah.
We're doing one at the moment. The only reason I know this, and it's like Byzantine dates, and you have to have this report, and it's actually the stage 2 or 3. I can't remember.
Well, it's good because everybody knows the rules. That's the good thing about
everybody
it.
knows the rules, which is good, right?
And also I think that what's really good about SHD is the first time ever that the local authority was obliged to bring all the people to the meeting, because in the past you go in for a development, it could be a major development, and you meet the planners and they said, well, you really need to talk to the roads people, or who should we talk to roads? And they didn't come to the meeting. And now with these big schemes, they have to bring all the people to the table. Yeah. So you've got someone from roads, ecology, and they all sit around the table and they can all give their opinions.
And in fairness,
that works.
I have noticed that they've gotten much better at that now that things are all done on Teams, and they all show up, which is a big improvement. And
well, it's helpful because then you can see, and then you ask them to engage as well, because you want someone you want anybody quiet at the meeting. If there's something to be said, say it, and then at least we can change it, address it. Not end up. And then the other thing about LRD, the large scale residential development, is that there's very limited opportunity to ask for further information. They can't ask, whereas in a normal application, there's almost a default. It says under legislation that a local authority, so you lodge an application, and say just take a conventional planning application, you lodge an application, and in the first 5 weeks, members of the public can pay €20 to make what they call submissions or observations, which 99 times out of 100 are opposed to the scheme.
Yeah.
But sometimes you get people writing in and said they support it.
I send the odd letter of support in.
Actually, did a hearing years ago where I was acting for all the people who were for the scheme, and it was driving all the third parties at the oral hearing mad because they kept saying, we're all opposed to it. And I'd say, sorry, we're not.
Yeah.
And 5 minutes later, we're not. Sorry, we're not.
There's a group in the UK called Just Build Homes. We're trying to actually get them on the podcast, and they coordinate people to write letters of support for development. It's a group of young people that started this thing.
Who'd like to live somewhere, you mean?
Who'd like to live somewhere, yeah.
As opposed to Melbourne.
Right. And we spoke to, in season 1, Brian, a guy from California.
Oh, the
California
YIMBYs guy. Yeah, I heard that.
So they're actually, they're a bit more serious. Like they have a lot of staff, a lot of funding to try and drive stuff on. Whereas this is like an activist-led thing in the UK. And like they're amazing. They're going around, they're going to council meetings, they're speaking up, they're showing, like, they're doing everything they can, which is really great to see, right? Because young people realize they have a voice. They can be really actually quite powerful.
We had one time about 2 years ago. It was one Saturday. We have a WhatsApp of where I live, and we have an SHD scheme quite close. And one of my neighbours was saying, oh, isn't it fantastic that it's been judicially reviewed? And I was sitting there saying, well, I could say nothing. I could get on with my life because it is Saturday, or I could say what I really think. So I said what I really thought.
No, right.
And it led to hours of back and forward. And most of the people were opposed to what I was saying, well, we shouldn't have it. We're like, the place is big enough, in Milltown, that it's big enough. And I said, no, it's not. It keeps growing. And I used the analogy. There's a book written in 1837 by Lawrence where he went around Ireland. And he wrote about places. And I quoted his description of Milltown in Dublin and said, you wouldn't recognise it because the place changed. And then there's a really good book came out about Milltown. It showed something in 1953, an aerial photograph. It's fascinating. But people are struggling. Where's that building? That wasn't there. Yeah. And things are built all the time. Yeah. And people seem to think that places are static, but they don't. They evolve all the time.
Yeah, well, when you are at the centre of your own universe, you do believe that everything else is moving around you.
So the state we live in was built in 1936. And before that was the back garden of a big house.
Yeah.
You know, and all these places are, if you look around Clonskee, was part of the grounds of Clonskee Castle, but now it's housing. Yeah. So you need to build houses. And we need, as I often said, it's either Ashbourne or Melbourne. So we either build houses for our children in Ireland or they're going to disappear.
Yeah, too right. I have I have 2 more acronyms. Okay. Wait, maybe I have 3. No, it's 2. UDZ. Okay,
UDZs. UDZs are the new shiny SDZs. UDZs are urban development zones. So the SDZs, of which there are 11, they can't create any more. They've reached that would be unless the minister brings one in now before the new Planning Act comes in. But in the new Planning Act, you'll have urban development zones, and urban development zones will be there'll be things called candidate urban development zones, where at the moment the STZs are for development of economic or social importance to the state, and the UDZs will be for economic, social, or environmental importance to the state. Oh. And it will be areas that a local authority will be requested by the minister. For all 31 local authorities will be sent off to look for candidate UDZs. So as I said, at the moment, we've 31 local authorities. We've got 13 SDZs. So, and Dublin's got the lion's share of them. So there's lots of counties in Ireland that don't have, like Limerick or Leitrim doesn't have a UDZ, doesn't have an SDZ. Yeah. So the government will send off, the minister will tell local authorities to go away and prepare these, identify sites that could be candidate or urban development zones. And then it will go eventually, the development plan will have to be changed to allow, and the development plans will have 10-year lives, so they'll have to be identified in a development plan that this area has been picked as a candidate urban development zone. There's a framework prepared for it by the local authority, and then it's like an SDZ, it goes to the Planning Appeals Board, and a planning scheme is put in place for it. So there might be more of them. They're just smaller versions of SDZs, but there might be more of them. And then the local authorities are supposed to be the development agencies. So the local authorities are to prepare these planning schemes. And in the government document a few years ago about local area plans, they said that developers can't put forward local area plans. So in the past, a developer said, I know you guys are really busy. We'll do one for you. We'll give it to you. You can have it democratically assessed by your councillors and we'll bring it forward as a scheme. And it was written in that developers couldn't do it. But do you know who can do it? Children. The guidelines on local area plans say that they must take on board the views of children. So I jokingly said to my children a few years ago, is there any chance one of you would send this in for me? Because I'm acting for this developer. He owns the land. You're not automatically obliged to talk to the landowner, but you are obliged under legislation to talk to children. So if you were to send in the document and sign it, Victoria, who's now in her mid-20s, sign it at age 6, it'd have to be taken on board. I mean, there's just, you couldn't make it up.
Jesus Christ. Okay. All right. Last one, LAP.
Local area plans, like mini development plans. So they're done for an area like Goatstown in Dublin or some part of Cork or some part of Limerick. There's a local area plan prepared by a local authority, and it's not adopted by it's adopted by the local authority, and it sets out kind of a framework for development of the area. And it's given its power by the development plan. So for example, at Goatstown, they wanted a civic square and buildings should be this, that, and the other height, but it's appealable. So,
right.
But it's a kind of it's a framework for developers to understand what they can and can't build.
Right. So instead of like a normal development plan, they'll say this land is going to be zoned for residential and it's maybe X number of hectares, but that's it. It's just residential, and then after that, we'll figure it out.
You might have to read your housing mix or something like that, but it doesn't say we need a civic square there.
Yeah, it doesn't dictate right? But
that.
The LAP
and a school
dictates.
It says there should be a school there and should be civic plaza there and there should be buildings here and the mix of uses should be this, or it's kind of relatively prescriptive.
Yeah, so like it's a good idea.
In theory, yeah.
In theory.
If it's well written.
If it's well written and if it's enforced. One thing that I've read about recently with the LAPs is when they expire, because they're separate. They're in the development plan, but they're separate, right?
And so there are 350 in the country.
Right.
Yeah.
But they can expire separate to the development plan.
They can. They have different life.
They have a different life, right? So what happens when a piece of land has an LAP on it and the LAP has expired?
A local authority or the board could say, we can't grant you permission because you're non-compliant with the LAP that has expired.
Yeah.
And it's a mess. And the new act has a piece in it that says that they can extant living LAPs, but it's silent on what happens to the dead LAPs.
Excellent.
And local authorities at the moment, as I had a letter the other day from one of the major local authorities saying, we can't deal with your proposed variation because we're gearing up to write our 10-year plan, having just in 2022 written our
like their regular
our 6-year development plan now, which we've got to gear up to write our 10-year development plans. Dublin City Council, which is a really good local authority, does loads of work, is under-resourced. It doesn't have the people, it doesn't have the bodies, and then the people are moving around. So you might have like the cultural shift. I was talking to a planner there a few weeks ago, who's a very senior planner in Dublin City Council, and he had been in another Dublin City local authority for 3 years, and he said when he left, there was no planner in his department who'd been there when he joined. And they've all left since because they're moving around all the time.
Oh, right.
And they've
that's
got that
a problem in itself.
It's a problem in all forms of work now, but particularly local authority, where you've got an innate knowledge of a part of the city or whatever, and then you lose it, or someone else comes in, they don't understand it. That I don't know how you stop. Well, you resolve it by resources. Give them more resources.
Yeah, and by giving them good working conditions and allowing them to make positive contributions. Like I don't think that planners would enjoy the way the system is set up either. This adversarial,
no, they don't.
Saying no, they're not going to enjoy that. That's not why anyone went to study planning.
No,
to say no, right? No, that's not how it.
Nor is it the Planning Act, because the Planning Act actually is. I always tell at the very first lecture I give to UCD students, I get them to work out what is the name of the Planning Act, and I put in some funny versions of it. One of it is the Planning and Development Act. Yeah. And it says an act to provide for housing, So it's all full of positive verbs.
Yeah.
But there's only 3 mentions in the 2000 Act. There's only 3 mentions of developers, and they're all negative. And if you look through your 920 pages of the current Act, you won't find the word viability anywhere in it. It's just, it doesn't appear. So
that's, I mean, look,
that's another podcast in itself.
It's a whole other series. Yeah. I have down here to ask you about like what's I use the word ridiculous, but like what's the planning case that sticks in your mind the most frustrating or most discouraging planning case that you
just asked me the other day, I was thinking, how many hours have we got?
Yeah. I pick one. I
picked the treatment of SHD was outstanding to me. It rankles me because there was an article written by 2 academics in UCD, and I'm on the staff of UCD technically, and I helped one of them write an article because he wanted me to explain the SHD, and I spoke as openly as I'm speaking here now, but he put that probably more openly because I thought, and he went and quoted me in it, but didn't say who it was. It was thinly disguised. It was me, clearly me, and it made us look as if we tried to hoodwink a minister into coming up with this newfangled system, which wasn't the case, because the minister had put out in writing asking people to make submissions, and we did it. And that sticks in my craw. And also the fact that newspapers were writing within 6 months, where are all these great SHDs we all wanted, like where are they? And the thing I made the point, there's a very good planning practice in the UK called Litchfields, and they write really, really good research pieces. And one of them was they'd done one about how the translation rate from permissions to housing, and they do it after 5 years. Yeah. And they said there was a 50% for large schemes. It was a 50% translation rate of permissions into large scale housing schemes after 5 years. Yeah. Within less than a year after SHD came out, certain newspaper articles are saying, where are all these houses? As if it was Angel Delight with a big thing of water and a massive wooden spoon, and suddenly all these houses are going to come out of it. So that to me is frustrating. Then I had one recently around the Ambassador Theatre, where we were refused permission to put railings around the Ambassador Theatre, and it was refused. And that's because it was a protected. And we're not in the public realm.
But you can't protect it.
You can't protect it from the people who sleep and do whatever they do beside buildings when they need to go. There's no toilet nearby. Yeah. And that is a small example. So we do everything in the office, from big to large schemes, small schemes. And that one, it just stuck. It was a recent one stuck in my craw. And also the other one, actually, is I'm looking at the window here down at Man Crescent and saw a lot of birds flying by. Once we heard Brent geese come out.
Yeah.
I know we've had a few of those. And there was one actually.
Were you involved in the one up in St. Anne's?
Yeah, we have been involved with that. And also one in Coolock, where the developer had done analyses showing there was no Brent goose. It did 4 years of bird surveys, and the board wasn't convinced. I love planning. I love my job, absolutely love it. But I find it frustrating, and I'm always trying to make it better, as everybody is. Like, no one's in it to make it worse. But
some people are in it to make it worse, okay. Tom. Like, but you can draw no other conclusion. The Planning Act is a missed opportunity for reform, and there's no other way of looking at it apart from that. There is a cohort of people that do not want things to change.
Yes, a friend of mine, actually, Paul, he lives in the States. I was talking about recently over Christmas, and he was saying about, I'd never come across this concept before, the Overton window. I don't know if you've ever come across it in political discourse. Yeah. And I just thought it'd be a really good thing to apply to the Irish planning system about housing, because it's basically saying that you take things that are acceptable, things that are kind of slightly odd, and then things that would be unthinkable. And if you were saying, well, if we were to apply that to the Irish planning system, and even for a short period, do things that might be unthinkable. If we could build houses really quickly, that wouldn't be good news for planning consultants because we'd be out of a job. But Ireland needs houses.
It's just
but these are all solvable problems. If Australia can do it with a 20 million population, why can't we do it? And I want to get something else that one of the questions you do ask, what really frustrates you as well. Myplan.ie, the one thing that really gets on my goat. In 2012, the government announced this, and you think about it, is how many of the world's leading tech companies are in Ireland?
Yeah.
Okay. And we have a system with 31 planning authorities that until recently, they had 4 different computer systems.
Yeah.
So the 31 local authorities couldn't talk to each other, and they couldn't talk to Bord Panola because their computer system wasn't linked.
Yeah.
And myplan.ie was raised by the minister in 2012, April 2012, and she said at the time that this is a very simple concept where you'd have a website that would show all the development plans stuck together physically on
a map.
Now, if you look at it today, most of the country is blank, and it says awaiting data.
Yeah,
because the local authorities haven't given the documents. So Dublin City Council's on it, and a lot of the Dublins are on it, but most of the country, it's blank. And if you look and you click on it and say, why can't I find out what that field is zoned without having to look at the Leitrim development plan? It says because awaiting data. Yeah. Like, how long do you wait?
It's not hard to do.
Another one, actually, funny one in a local authority about 2 years ago, was actually quite a funny story. A planner was on a Zoom call, and the planner started giving out to me and said, well, Tom, there was about 6 or 7 people, including a client on the call, and said, well, Tom, it would have helped if you sent in the drawings at the correct scale. And I said, we did. And she said, yes, but I'm working from home. I said, what's your point? He said, I'm working off a computer. And I said, but the drawings are physically in your office at the correct scale. And I had to explain to her that the fact you're looking at a computer, it was like Father Ted series, like Near and Far Away. I said, the fact that you're looking at your computer doesn't mean that the physical drawings in your office, should you decide to go in there, are at the correct scale.
You probably don't get that Father Ted reference, did you?
It wasn't really a thing in Canada.
You didn't really have Catholic priests.
So you're from Canada, because just as well I said how good Canadian planners were.
She's a critical skill.
No, general.
Are you general skill?
So we got a planner in, there are Canadian planners in to the general list, but it took 6 months.
Yeah.
And a lot of hoo-ha.
Yeah, well, we're the hoo-ha.
advertising.
You had to move to Portugal.
I had to leave the country in the middle of COVID, and it took about 5 months for mine as well.
Yeah.
God. Yeah. It's nuts.
And she was complaining about it, but she was in Lisbon, beachside apartment.
Okay, well, yeah,
you know, her team's thing was set to away a lot of the time.
Yeah, we're dead right.
So I think she was having a pretty good time, still getting paid.
Proper order.
Oh no, you weren't getting paid actually because we couldn't employ you.
I wasn't legal.
No, okay. So I feel a little bit more sorry for you now. All right, Tom, I've used up way too much of your time here, but I have other things. Magic wand. What's your?
That one was the one I said. The myplan.ie. That we actually
That's your magic wand.
No. It sounds like such a simple thing. We don't have. Oh, sorry, a wish, isn't it? Kind of wish.
It's a wish.
Yeah. I wish.
Well, it's not a wish. Okay. It's like you can do it. You have the power.
We have my power is I'm going to. Well, honestly, I'd actually love to be Minister for Housing.
Okay, that's the first person who said that. This
is going to be thrown back at me because I believe that Darragh O'Brien has his first name. But actually, you could be made a senator. The Constitution allows 2 people to be made a senator, and then you can be made a minister. And that would probably drive half of the anti-development world mad if I became minister. But I would actually, in an ideal world, I'd love to be Minister of Housing because I'd have cranes on the skyline within weeks. Yeah. I'd be building houses because we need to build houses. So it's to put in place some form of mechanism to allow houses to be built and get permission in a much more collegiate way, that the local authorities are not adversarial, that they're working with developers to make it happen. But my very simple task would be all these high-tech companies in Ireland, and yet there's no map you can click it on and say this is all zoned map land in Ireland, and these are all this is the layer of all the service land, and these are all the layers of the bus routes and the train routes, etc. So it's to have myplan.ie doctored, and I wouldn't say it'd take more than a week to get that up and running. Yeah. And such a simple thing, and stop saying awaiting data. I tell you what, pick up the phone, ring the guy in Leitrim and say, send me on that
we're
GIS.
Not asking.
Yeah, just give it to me. I need it 1 week. And then the minister brings them all in, all the 31 chief executives, and said, why haven't you done it? Well, Dublin City Council's done it, and other places have done it. Why haven't you done it? And if there's some impediment, I'm the minister, there's an impediment called Joe or Jane in my department who's stopping from doing it. I want them in my office after lunch, and I want to know what they're going to do.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
It's a simple
simple
task.
Thing, yeah. So you kind of have it too there because you're like, you want to be appointed Minister for Housing.
No, that was my facetious one, that was just a joke.
So,
I mean, I know they leave the minister out because I've never put myself forward.
Because the headline is going to be Tom Phillips backed up by the army.
No, it's not. Because I mean, these people put themselves forward. God knows why. It's masochistic to be democratically elected, so it has to be democratic. But I think in times of crisis, you need to do certain things, and that could be the Overton window where you do something that's technically unthinkable.
We did it. COVID. We did it. We did. Turned around. We're like, yep, emergency. We're doing this. You don't like it.
I'd like the headline to be the master or the myplan.ie. I think that's just a simple solution.
Book recommendation?
Yeah, simple one. It's a book by a guy called Simon Sinek, Sinek. And I came across him on TED Talks years ago.
Oh, okay.
And it's a book called Start With Why. And he says that in any good company should not start saying how they do things or why they do or what they do, but should say why they do it. And every time I write, when I do all my lectures, I always start off, I write everything in 3s, and I say why I'm giving that lecture, how I'm going to tell them about it, and what I need them to know. And when I write reports, I do the same thing. Just simple thing. It's the golden circle of why, how, and what in that order. And that's what Apple do and what other places do. And I use the analogy of in that thing about the invalidation, about why you'd want to write a book about invalidation, as opposed to saying there's 15.5% of all planning applications are invalidated, blah, 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 blah. So first reason instead of why you do it, why you'd write the thing is to highlight something that can be solved, that can be fixed to make it perfect from the start, as opposed to have inherent flaws in the system. And there's so many things in planning that we could do that we could make it proper from the start, and then it would work accordingly.
What was the quote that you had at this?
It was about
design it from the.
Yeah, it was a great thing in Simon's book about a Japanese automotive engineer went to America to see how an automated line worked in terms of the factory in an American car plant. And he was looking at it. And then at the very end of the production line, this guy came out with a rubber mallet and started tapping the doors and standing back, a bit like a snooker player, and looking at the car, checking the line along the side of the car, and then tapping it with this rubber mallet. And the Americans were very proud of this. And they turned to the Japanese guy and said, "What do you think?" And he said, "What's that man doing?" And they said, "He's just making sure it's perfect." And the Japanese guy said, "Well, why doesn't he make it perfect? Why don't you design the car to be perfect from the start? Why do you need somebody with a rubber mallet to come along and fix it?" And I use that analogy to get across the point about the planning system. Why don't you, if you know something's wrong, if you know invalidation is part of the system, why do you accept it? Why don't you have zero tolerance for invalidation and put in place a simple thing that you can't lodge an application unless you've had it validated by the local authority? And then you could even put things like put a barcode on a site notice that someone could look it up and they could see what the scheme was, or whatever it is. If that makes the public complain more, so be it. But at least you've got the system there that people know will work. And if a site notice is up on a site, it means there is a valid application behind it.
So I think I could sum up it by saying design it better.
Yeah, design it better. Like it's a planning and development act, and we've a housing crisis. One of the things we can't even, the state brought out back in 2024 4 different documents, including the Housing Commission, which is just actually that's another thing I'm going to say to you. A quick one about the thing. Do you know, this is a good one. The Housing Commission came out with 83 recommendations, and 2 weeks later, the department came out with a review of the 83 recommendations, and it said that of the 83, 65 were either implemented, underway, or partially underway. And if you think about it, I was just thinking the other day about an analogy. Supposing your wife went out and said, "You know that the fridge door is loose."
Yeah.
And you go, "Yeah." And she goes off and she comes back a few hours later and said, "What have you done?" And you said, "Well, it's either, in terms of fixing it, it's either implemented, it's underway, or it's partially underway." And she goes, knowing me, she'd say it was partially underway. "So what have you done?" I said, "Well, I went down to Woody's and I bought a screwdriver."
Yeah.
So therefore it's partially underway. So forget about it, let's move on.
It's commenced.
It's commenced, yeah. And that is the level of, and nobody said, "Come off it." Now, like, of the 83, really, how many of them actually are done?
Yeah.
Well, like, what does partially underway mean? Like, it's great, isn't it? I must do that in future. Like, if you attend to a kid that goes into school and hasn't done the homework, and the teacher says, "Well, have you done it?" "Well, it's partially underway." "What do you mean?" "Well, I have my pens and my paper here." So anyway,
oh my God,
we could keep on for hours.
Yeah, we could. Tom Phillips, thanks so much for coming in. I can't believe. I mean, I feel like we've been here for 10 minutes, but we've been here for an hour and a half. And there's a lot of stuff on the list that I think maybe we might get you to come back after the Planning Act has been commenced.
Okay, when I'm Minister for Housing, is it? When
you're Minister for Housing. Well, now you've agreed to the interview now, once you are appointed 100%. Minister. Yeah. Thanks so much for coming in and for all that. There's a lot in there. And I think that for people who aren't in the industry, who are interested in planning, there's a lot of information actually that you guys have published, which is written in very clear-eyed manner, and I think lay people could understand it. So thank you for doing that, for your contribution to the industry. And I really, really appreciate it. I've learned things today. I can't say I feel that much more hopeful. Unless your coup comes off, then I feel very hopeful. So thanks a lot for coming in.
Thank you, Deej.
The Build is produced by Carrie Fernandez and me, Rick Larkin. Music is by Cass.